Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into some incredibly fascinating and highly critical socioeconomic and Marxist perspectives on the global pharmaceutical industry. Drawing directly from academic journals and political policy documents, we're going to unpack a growing argument out there. The argument is basically this. Pharmaceutical innovation is actually declining, while the costs to the public are absolutely skyrocketing. Now, whether you personally agree with these perspectives or not, understanding the mechanics of how they break down this system is just a really captivating exercise. So let's get into it.
So first off, where do new drugs actually come from? I think a lot of us just kind of assume that giant pharma companies invent all our medicines internally, right? Scientists working away in these massive, privately funded, top-secret laboratories. But the critical sources we're looking at today ask us to fundamentally hit pause on that assumption. They argue that this whole narrative of the lone corporate innovator might actually be a bit of an illusion. And the hard data behind that claim is pretty staggering. According to an analysis of 323 new FDA-approved drugs from the top 20 pharma companies between 2015 and 2021, a massive 65% actually originated externally. Just 28% were discovered internally by these corporate giants. The sources argue that this totally shatters the illusion of internal corporate innovation, suggesting that big pharma is actually relying more and more on external startups, universities, and government labs to make the real breakthroughs.
And look, the global stakes of how this entire system is managed are literally life-altering. As highlighted in the texts, the World Health Organization points out a gut-wrenching reality. 100 million people fall into poverty every single year simply because they have to pay for medicines out of pocket. So this isn't just some abstract economic debate happening in a vacuum. It's a structural issue with profound real-world human consequences. To make sense of all this, we've broken this explainer down into 5 clear parts. We'll cover the medical innovation paradox, intellectual monopolies and patents, financialization and ethical crisis, the human cost, and finally, prescriptions for systemic change. All right, part 1, the medical innovation paradox. We're looking at the weird reality of slowing medical breakthroughs happening at the exact same time as record-breaking industry revenues. The sources point out a really stark contrast here between public risk and private reward. See, groundbreaking basic biomedical research is largely funded by the public. Think government agencies like the NIH or university labs. But thanks to legal frameworks introduced over the last few decades, these publicly funded discoveries are very often patented, licensed, and commercialized by private corporations. Critics argue this basically sets up a system where the public takes on all the initial financial risk of the basic research, but private corporations reap the massive financial rewards through high drug prices. And what exactly are those rewards incentivizing? Well, according to the academic critiques we're exploring, it's often not genuine innovation. Instead, the industry heavily focuses on what are called Me Too drugs. The data shows that between 1990 and 2004, 77% of FDA-approved drugs were duplicative. That means they were just minor, easily marketable variations of treatments that already existed, rather than actual new therapeutic breakthroughs. Turns out, slightly tweaking a wildly profitable formula is just way safer for the bottom line than taking a huge risk to cure a completely new disease. So what's driving this stagnation? That brings us to part 2, intellectual monopolies and patents. A Marxist critique frames our current era as intellectual monopoly capitalism. Basically, in this view, companies aren't just making profits by manufacturing goods really efficiently anymore. Instead, they're acting as rentiers. That means they legally enclose knowledge through patents and then extract rent from absolutely anyone who needs access to it. The entire focus shifts away from the normal capitalist idea of making better products and moves toward fiercely guarding legal monopolies over ideas. And when you have an unregulated market, these intellectual monopolies become what economists call price makers. Because a patent grants total exclusivity, a company can charge literally whatever the market can bear. Look no further than the exact same diabetes drug, Januvia, back in 2013. It cost $1.99 in Europe, but a whopping $8.20 in the much more loosely regulated United States market. On top of that, the sources describe this phenomenon called the tragedy of the anti-commons. Now, we usually think of patents as a way to encourage sharing information, right? But researchers argue that overly broad patents, completely undisclosed trade secrets, which is especially huge for complex biologic drugs, and up to 12 years of statutory data exclusivity actually build legal brick walls. It creates these layered legal blockades that actively stop other scientists from doing further research. Moving right along to part 3,
financialization, and ethical crises. Let's look at how modern finance actually reshapes what happens in the lab.
Here's where Wall Street enters the chat. The text outlines how the industry has become highly financialized, meaning the strategic priority shifts from delivering value to patients to delivering value to shareholders. Instead of pouring all that revenue back into long-term R&D, massive chunks of profit are used for corporate stock buybacks just to artificially boost share prices. Marxist economists call this an prime economy, or a speculative money-making money loop. It basically detaches wealth creation from actual scientific output. You're innovating stock prices, not medicine.
And academic analyses, like those from the International Journal of Law, point out that this intense commercial pressure doesn't just stay in the boardroom. It bleeds right into the scientific process itself. When your ultimate goal is a financial return on an intellectual property asset, it creates some really profound ethical and bioethical crises in how research is conducted.
Take a look at this incredibly concerning study on research bias mentioned in the texts. It found that a massive 96% of authors who published favorable articles about specific drugs had financial ties to the actual manufacturer of that drug. It really makes you wonder, if patents enclose the drug itself, do they also end up enclosing the very science the public relies on to know if that drug is even safe? Which leads us to part 4, the human cost. These high-level economic theories translate into very real physical realities for people all over the world.
Let's circle back to that absolutely staggering number we talked about at the beginning, 100 million. 100 million people are pushed into poverty annually simply trying to afford out-of-pocket medical costs. The critique argues this isn't an accident. It is the direct structural outcome of an intellectual monopoly system that puts patent extraction above global public health. And this cost extends to how these medications are actually tested. The sources detail how the aggressive pursuit of cheaper clinical trials in the global south has had some truly tragic outcomes. Between 2005 and 2017, there were 4,967 deaths during drug trials in India alone. The texts note that this outsourcing is very often fueled by finder's fees paid to medical practitioners, which severely compromises the ability to get genuine, informed consent from highly vulnerable populations. To top it off, a Marxist epidemiological perspective argues that this profit-driven system enforces what they call a unifactorial approach to health. What does that mean? It means the system focuses almost exclusively on patentable pills to treat diseases. And the reason is simple. You can't patent clean water, a healthy diet, or safe working conditions. Those things just don't generate corporate intellectual rent. So the system deliberately ignores the massive social, environmental, and class-based root causes of illness.
All right, final section, part 5, prescriptions for systemic change. Given all these heavy critiques, what's the actual fix? Well, organizations like the UK Labour Party, along with various Marxist scholars, propose some pretty radical shifts. One major idea is delinkage, which means completely separating the cost of R&D from the final price of the drug at the pharmacy. They also advocate for expanding public control over medicine manufacturing, essentially treating medical knowledge as a shared global commons rather than private property, and fully embracing open science, where researchers can just collaborate freely without bumping into patent walls. Zooming out even further, these academics advocate for a shift towards something called historical materialist epidemiology. It's a mouthful, I know, but the idea is actually pretty straightforward. It's a practice that views treating public health as totally inseparable from fixing unequal social structures. Basically, it means fighting the root causes of disease, like poverty, terrible sanitation, and inequality, with the exact same energy and funding that we use to synthesize a new chemical compound in a lab. Ultimately, these critical analyses leave us to ponder a seriously profound question about global healthcare. If the legal and economic engines of our medical system are designed first and foremost to protect intellectual property and maximize shareholder returns, can a system driven by profit ever truly prioritize public health? It's a provocative thought, and it really challenges the foundation of how we innovate and heal as a society. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you learn.